Our discussion today is hosted by the Futurelect Alumni, and our engagements are on pertinent topics across democracy and democracy building in Africa. Our topics center on politics, on governance, and limited representation of women and youth in public office. I'd like to welcome you to our final webinar, hosted by the Botswana alumni. As you all know, close to 20 countries in Africa have gone to election this year. Many of them, we have many lessons to learn, like Zimbabwe, Lesotho, as well as Botswana in the most recent election. Without wasting any more time, I'd like to jump straight into it, and I'd like to introduce our moderator, a dear friend, and a fellow of our 2020 cohort, Lesego from Botswana, who introduced our esteemed panelists. We're absolutely thrilled that you've availed yourself for this very important discussion on the Botswana election. Over to you, Lesego.
Thank you so much, Tozama. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's an incredible honor, and we're truly humbled that you have taken this time to participate in this conversation. We are overwhelmed by the response that we've gotten so far, and we believe that this will be the first of many conversations to have. Just as a precursor to what we're about to jump into, or before we start the conversation, I think just some ground rules. This is a very exciting topic, I think, especially for colleagues from Botswana. And so feel free to use the chat function if you have questions or have any comments. We'll try to refer to them and include them in the conversation as we move along. We've also received an incredible amount of questions as well prior to the webinar, and those we will also try to incorporate within the conversation and bring them up as and when we can discuss them. While I trust my incredible panel that we have today, they're not necessarily experts in all things or understand the inner workings or can prophetically speak to what is going to happen. But I do think that we all have some insights that we can share. So your comments are welcome in that sense. And then lastly, all the views and opinions expressed on this webinar are those of the panelists. It doesn't necessarily mean it represents the organizations that are a part of or Futurelect. So just wanted to lay some of those ground rules. Towards the end, we will have a short Q&A session. And if you feel compelled to share or say something outside of the chat, I will point out to you when you use the raise hand function, and then please unmute your mic and then share what you have to say. And keep your comments as brief as possible, 2 to 3, even less, 2 minutes, 2-minute comments or questions that we'll be saving for towards the end. So before we get started and I open up the conversation to my panelists, I'd first like to just set the context of why this is such an important discussion. When we think about what has happened democratically in Botswana, there were papers that were written by Asimoglu, Robinson, and Johnson about how Botswana is an African success story, how our factor endowment and rent has set Botswana up for what it is today, strong institutions, and also democratic consolidation was in our trajectory when you looked at the kind of academic scholarship around the country at the time. Fast forward to 2016, there was an article written by Kim Dion in the Washington Post that talk about how Botswana is now on a negative governance trajectory, how we are now on an autocratic kind of path, and that we are moving away from those democratic ideals that a lot of academia had been speaking to or describing Botswana as. So there was a significant gap between our reputation versus the reality that we're experiencing. And now, since 2016 until now, there's been a significant change within our government. Botswana quietly, I would say, decided to create an upset in the polls. I thought that South Africa, for example, during the GNU had done something incredible in regards to this region with just the GNU within itself, not anticipating that this would be the same sort of story that we would see today. So we have sort of that path that we've just experienced, and it'll be interesting post-elections to see what this means for Botswana as a democracy. Are we regaining back that sense of democratic consolidation? Can we move closer and closer towards democratization? And then all the other nuances and issues that surround that and what it means and the implications are what we'll be discussing today. So without further ado, I have three incredible panelists: Dr. Gabriel Malebang, who is a lecturer at the University of Botswana; Sonia, who is from BCPI; and Victor Badwing, who represents the media and works for Sunday Standard, a credible newspaper within the country. Those are the voices that we have today. So just to get your first perspective, what were your initial thoughts? We'll start with you, Dr. Gabriel, when the announcement of the elections were happening, and what did you sense in terms of the mood or the urgency or the kind of changes that we were experiencing during the election period? And what do you think kind of led to this upset that was honestly, in many senses, unexpected? Dr. Gabriel.
Yes, thank you very much, Lesotho. Good evening, everyone. Of course, my initial reaction was that of shock. Although, as a political scientist, I've been following over the years, both in my academic work and teaching, the trends around, our electoral democracy. We didn't really see a change of government coming, at least not this time around. People were talking about a hung parliament and, an increase in the number of seats for the opposition, but not an outright removal of the ruling party. Of course, in the past, Botswana has been described as a choiceless democracy because it seemed like citizens were content with the ruling party. I mean, people were asking questions like, why fix what's not broken? Others in the academic literature describe Botswana as a hollow democracy or a reprocracy, where you are preoccupied with voting in representatives, whereas the quality of the democracy, as experienced and felt by the citizens, had somewhat deteriorated and been eroded. So it's on the basis of that and the social contract that a state is supposed to fulfill in terms of providing the social services and the basic services to citizens that led to what we saw on the one hand. But on another level, we heard many reports of the deterioration in the economic performance, particularly the strained relations between the Botswana government and DBS, and the rumors and reports that the government may struggle to meet some of its obligations in the second half of the year and things like that. So given the type of citizenry that we have in Botswana, we have been accustomed to a social welfare or a developmental state. They thrived on the certainty and assurance and the trust invested in the government to deliver. So if you tamper with that, those basic bread and butter issues, you are bound to see that kind of thing. But just to close off on my introductory remarks, the issue here that we are seeing in retrospect is that this was a protest vote against the leader of the Botswana Democratic Party, and the former President Masisi, in terms of how it appears he had lost touch with the needs and the mood of the average citizen on the ground. Now, because of our electoral system, the first past the post system, if you are to remove the president, because we don't have a presidential system, you by extension remove the party. So given the erosion of inner party democracy, the suffocation and lack of dissenting voices within the ruling party, the results that we see are largely attributed to the members of the Botswana Democratic Party who were not happy with the leadership of President Masisi. And by extension, they didn't have the avenues within the party to express that discontent. So when it came to the polls, even if they thought that they were just removing or punishing the party, they ended up now adding to the votes of opposition parties and with the results that we see today. So in closing, I cannot say that the UDC, which has won the majority of the seats, won solely on their campaign promises and the message and the brand that they projected. So a large part of it also came from the voters who are members of the Botswana Democratic Party. Let me pause there for now.
Thank you so much. I think that's necessary context for everybody who might not understand what led up to these events and the players that are involved. So that is much appreciated. Sonia, over to you. In terms of the defining factors of this political movement that we just saw, what would you say this signifies? Are we on the precipice of a political evolution in Botswana? Because I feel like, as Dr. Gabriel had mentioned, this was a protest vote, but in the last election cycle, when people voted in large numbers towards the former president, it was also a protest vote to the former president as well. So are we in that sense of political evolution in Botswana where citizens now directly can challenge the government using the vote? And will that be the trend, or will this define our political history moving forward?
Okay, thank you, Lesego, and good evening once again to fellow panelists and our audience. Definitely, I think if you look at the literature, like Dr. Malebang pointed out, that a lot of the characterization, perhaps maybe the not so celebratory characterization of Botswana's democratic credentials, has been resting on the fact that the country had never experienced a change of government. Administration, yes, but never government. And the reason that was accounting for a lot of that criticism was the significance of that very act of changing a government, especially if we look at Africa, where a lot of countries' current contexts, whether positive or negative, but largely negative, were precipitated by a singular change of government. And from that single event, things unfortunately went downhill from there. That's just the extent of the significance of what has happened. And even if you look at more of the literature in terms of the process towards democratic consolidation, a large part of that as well is usually also resting on the extent to which a citizenry is able to get accustomed to the act of changing government. If you look at things like the true turnover test, famous by Dr. Huntington, and him saying that a democracy is truly consolidated and mature when it has done that twice. It shows that the fact that we have now ticked off our first event of the same, it's a big issue. And I think the extent of that change in the political landscape, as early days as it is, can be seen even now. If you look at the kind of discourse. Of course, being a young person, I'm more prone to seeing such discourse on social media. But even if you look at the discourse, and especially amongst young people, they have, I guess, gotten a proper taste of what it looks like to exercise and enjoy your right to vote. And it seems some people cannot even wait for the next cycle of voting to either reward or punish the current government, as the case may be. So I think it's definitely a show of a huge shift in terms of we are going to see what I think is a shift from the sort of conservative way of thinking, the way Botswana have been so shy of a change of government, partly, like I said, because we know many examples where that was the beginning of the end for a lot of country. And now that they've successfully passed the first such kind of test, I think we're definitely going to see the issue of a possible change in government being amplified in our next electoral cycle. And I think it will be shown as well in our next electoral cycle. The kind of campaigning that we should expect there, I imagine is going to be much different from what we have become accustomed to over the years, simply because now all parties, even the current government, will be aware of the fact that the current electorate is much different from the last.
Thank you, Sonia. And adding on to that, Victor, there were obviously a lot of stories that came out. I would say you were closer to public sentiment on what people perceive the political landscape to be. Would you say that you are observing these shifts in recent years, and what does it mean moving forward for the country, not only in terms of elections, but also in terms of governance?
Yeah, I think like Sonia had mentioned, thank you, Lesego, and good evening. I think I missed that part of pleasantries. Well, I was going to say, like Sonia was saying, the youth engagement this time, or the youth participation this time, was very crucial. If you look at the numbers, you'd realize that the Botswana population is largely a youthful one. So in the past, we had seen a trend where participation was very low, but this time around, we saw in the social media space, your X, your Facebook, the youth came first during the registration time to showcase or to show that they were participating by sharing the registration cards and everything else, and try to encourage their peers to also go and register. And then secondly, even on the builds up towards the election day, the polls day, we saw a lot of encouragement in the social media space. And I think that also played a critical role. But the most important thing, take home is that much as the populace here is youthful, they are the one who are actually feeling the crash of the economy. Unemployment rate is very high, and there are limited opportunities. So because of those factors, they end up reflecting what we got. And I would surely agree with Dr. Malebang when he says it's almost like, I don't know if that's Dr. Malebang, it was you who was saying, it's almost like a protest vote from the populace. And like I said, this populace is largely youth. And that's what we saw. Remember, even a few days before the elections, there was a protest march against a controversial bill that was brought to Parliament, which directly spoke to the economics of the people. And part of the people, or the large majority that I saw in that protest, were the youth themselves. And you could see where they were driving to. You could see from the tweets, the Facebook posts that they were making, that ultimately they were going to remove the former ruling party.
So it sounds like, Victor, you already had a sense that this would happen, while the rest of us were in total shock. It sounds like you could already tell that there would be this change.
Yes, the sentiment was there. I think the only proof that one didn't have was whether those who were actually making their comments public had registered, or whether they were eligible to vote. That was the only trick, or that was the only unanswered question. But in terms of the direction that they were going, it was quite clear that they were certainly going to remove the former ruling party.
Thank you for that. Over to you, Dr. Gabriel. You mentioned how there's this shift happening because of, obviously, the lack of dissenting voices, the economic challenge, socioeconomic challenges that we were experiencing as a country that were not uncommon in a sense for a developmental state like ourselves, or a social welfare state. So what are the opportunities or challenges that exist for this government? Because while people, yes, are excited about the change, the reality still stands that these challenges are quite imminent, and we're feeling them day to day, as is the case in Botswana at the moment. So what are the challenges moving forward, particularly since this is a government that has never ruled or governed before? Some people can say they might not have experience in these areas. So what do you think will be the biggest challenges moving forward for this new government, balancing out some of those things that they have to address immediately, outside of just the need for change democratically?
Thank you so much for that. Just to ride on your last comments before I delve into the challenges, with regard to the lack of experience of the new government. This indeed is a historic event, and as Sonia was highlighting, just to add on to what she said about the two turnover tests, to give it a bit of context. This is to say that Botswana, which has had independence for 58 years, had never before experienced a change of government. Some, to the casual observer, it may have seemed as if the democracy could be described as a mature democracy just on the basis of the length of time that it had been in existence. However, the maturity came when now there was a smooth transfer of power. So this is what, when Huntington talks about the two turnover test, he refers to, that there should be an exchange of power between two political parties peacefully. And this should happen 2 times in order for this to be, or for a particular country to be described as having a mature democracy. So as Sonia mentioned, the first leg or the first test has happened, and we are yet to see if this could happen again. Now, delving into the challenges that you were highlighting, of course, there was a number of issues. For example, last year, there were many reports about lack of medicines in hospitals, dilapidated infrastructure in schools, incomplete infrastructure projects, and a plethora of other issues coming up. Now, these confront the new government as it comes in, more so that when at the beginning of this year, the former government, the BDP government, embarked on a whole extravaganza of groundbreaking projects, and they were announcing many subsidy schemes, and all of it to the careful observer sounded like electioneering, because they spoke a lot about these quick impact projects, which I guess voters were able to see through what was happening, because at the end of the day, with the number of new programs that were introduced, Chema, and many others that were being mentioned by the former government, one would have thought that they would have appealed to the electorate and appeased them in a way to vote for the ruling party, because they had that tagline which said there's still no alternative. This meant that they needed to reassure the voter that the certainty that they had entrenched over the years was still there and that they could still be trusted. However, it would seem that at an individual level, each citizen per capita, given their individual constraints and their experiences of the economic downturn, the experiences of the challenges that they were going through, they voted differently. The voter behavior came out in the way it did. And so the new government then has the first order of business, the economy, to recover. And indeed, we've seen in the last 2 weeks, the week before the inauguration of the new leader, the CEOs or the leadership of the DBS came into the country. They attended, the inauguration. This morning again, we heard that they went to meet the president, this time also accompanied by the CEO of Anglo American. And this speaks to the fact that diamonds, which are the mainstay of the economy of Botswana, and it goes to show in a way that the DBS issue was an important election issue, because we heard reports that the relations between the government of Botswana and DBS had been strained in the run-up to the elections. And the language that we were hearing from both the DBS side and the Botswana, the new administration side, was the urgent need to repair the relationship and also to respect each other as the contracting parties, and also how this partnership had for many years, been portrayed as the model to be embraced around the world, and that it would have been unfortunate if it was allowed to deteriorate. So then beyond that, we hear reports also of many people challenging the new government to live up to its promises, particularly with regards to the social protection issues, such as the old age pensions, the minimum wage, as well as the allowances for university students and things like that. And in a campaign trail, we hear that the President Raboko had mentioned that all of these would be paid out immediately 1 month after they had been elected into office. And many reports are saying that demanding that such payments be made. But we heard the vice president, who doubles as the finance minister, informing the nation that this new administration inherited an empty kitty bag, or the coffers were almost depleted, and that the first order of business would be for them to rehabilitate the economy, going as far as pledging that he and the president may consider taking a salary cut for at least a year as a way of demonstrating the austerity, the austere economic outlook, and their commitment to belt tightening, as it were. So it's the economy, it's the health sector, and living up to some of those campaign promises that were made. That's it.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Just for those that are coming in and joining us, thank you so much. We have started our conversation about the new democracy and the perspectives around it. And so we encourage you to also pose your questions or comments in the chat function as we're having the conversation. If there's something that inspires you to share your thoughts, please do so in the chat function as we prepare towards a Q&A towards the end. Now, Sonia, in terms of the NGO space, there was a lot of pushback for people to, challenge the government, get it to account, establishing more governance, building better institutions. Do you anticipate that this will continue to be the role of NGOs in Botswana, or to kind of, keep the peace considering this change? There's also a lot of rhetoric, we need to support this government. We need to understand that they're inheriting a lot of difficulty, and therefore, let's be supportive. That is also the sentiment on the ground. So what will be that role that NGOs might potentially play in this new dispensation?
Well, I think at least in the short term, I'm not anticipating that civil society will be inclined to sort of dial back the role that they're currently playing in the governance space, especially considering that for a long time, the deficit of Botswana civil society, insofar as making meaningful impact within the socio-political landscape, has been a cause for concern. I'm sure you've seen maybe, multiple conversations around the same academic analysis of what it is that is incapacitating Botswana civil society. So I think having enjoyed a meaningful role within the country's governance landscape, especially this year. If you look at the activity around the constitutional amendment bill, the activity around the bills that were ultimately withdrawn on presidential benefits, if you look at the role of civil society within that and how pronounced it was, and the ultimate effect in terms of Botswana's democracy benefiting from such a vibrant civic space, I would be at pains to explain why they would retreat if they were to do that. I'm not expecting that. In fact, my thoughts and perhaps also my hope is that this year's activities are taken as motivation to push harder, not to politic against or for the current government, but push harder in terms of continuing to make visible and audible pronouncements in favor of of democracy. So that would be, if it's genuine, it would be in favor or against government following current affairs and developments within the democratic landscape. So I think that's my expectation, but it's also, of course, my hope that the civic society, much like the democracy of the country, is all the better after this year's events. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So for you, Victor, I wanted to ask about seeing some of the comments that I'm seeing in the chat about optimism in regards to this new government. For the fourth estate, usually at the beginning terms of a new government coming in, there's a lot of enthusiasm. The government also promises this openness and engagement with the fourth estate. Do you anticipate that this will sort of be the same relationship, or things will remain as they are? We start off really great, and then as we move along, there's more criticisms from the fourth estate, or the government isn't as open or engaging, as it were. How do you think this will change in this new government, or rather this change that we're experiencing with new party?
Yeah, I think part of the things that would actually give us an idea of what kind of this government is the decision they're going to make. For instance, the new government, when they were still on the opposition side, they were pushing for the Freedom of Information Act, which is a law that particularly speaks to journalists, directly to journalists, but to any other member of the public who might be interested in getting any specific information from the government enclave. So since the new government was pushing for that when they were still in the opposition side, our expectation from the media side is that ultimately we're going to have to see them tabling the bill and ultimately turn it into a law, because for us it's really non-negotiable. It's something that they had actually told us that they are rooting for, and we cannot wait for them to actualize that, because they are now in power. It's just a matter of looking at that draft, sharing it with us for comments, and possibly put it in place. Because if you look at some of the issues, some of the burning issues that are happening now in our country, for example, I know there's one particular gentleman in this country who's trying to push up a protest against one of the development agencies in the country. That happened largely because of the lack of Freedom of Information Act. If we had that law, at any point, any journalist or any member of the public would have used that law to actually obtain certain information from that particular agency. So because of lack of that law, now we find a situation where the new government is actually going to be facing a lot of protests and a lot of demands from the citizens, because they had made pronouncement. The president himself has, on more than 3 occasions since he was in office, assured the nation that he is pro-protest. He said he spoke to the police to ask them to actually let the people protest if they want to. So it's one of those that I think is going to be easy to follow up. If the new government is not going to put up the Freedom of Information Act, I'm sure the members of the press and the members of the public would be willing to go to the street and demand for that.
Great, thank you for that. Just from a little bit of just what I'm hearing and some of your comments so far, it doesn't sound to me that there's a lot of enthusiasm. It sounds like it's business as usual. We will see this government do what it does and then hope for the best, but we will challenge where necessary. We'll hold them to account. I'm just wondering, just based off of what your own thoughts and what you are expressing, do you feel there's still something to look forward to? Are you excited about anything in particular? Not to force it, though. I'm not saying you should be pro-government, but it doesn't, it feels as though we're just hoping that, some of the things that we had hoped would have happened by now, should be on the table, and we should be moving towards, though nothing drastic, as it were, in terms of what this new government potentially represents. It doesn't sound like that is the sentiment, just from all 3 of you. So I'm curious if there is anything in any of you feeling that sense of drastic change that we can anticipate. And you can also draw from examples that we've seen across the region in terms of change in government. Can we anticipate any drastic changes moving forward? Sonia, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think in terms of drastic changes, those were promised, and I'm sorry for my change in visuals and audio. My laptop decided to update randomly, so I'm now connected via my mobile. Sorry for that. But I think in terms of the extent of changes that we can expect, I think those will be influenced by the extent to which the new government will be able to deliver on their manifesto promises. Like I said, there are some promises in there, especially those relating to the economic side of this, things that are quite some might say ambitious, some might say, people driven, depending on which side of the fence you are on, but very evidently much different from what we've become accustomed to. So I think if the new government is able to deliver on a majority of those, then to that extent we can say that we can expect drastic changes. If you look at perhaps some of the changes that have already been made in terms of the composition of the ministries, the sort of main issues, for example, I would say the institutional independence one. If you look at some of our oversight institution, and I know Victor Badoing got to ask the president on that this morning on whether we are going to now finally see the DCEC, the DIS, and other institutions come out from under the control of the office of the president. As it seems right now, that might be where we're heading. If those changes are implemented, then that would constitute drastic changes, considering that that change in particular is something that has been talked about for years. The need for independence of some of these institutions. So to finally achieve that would fall under the category of drastic changes. But I think in terms of also the everyday lived realities of Botswana, I always like to make that distinction between changes at the high level and changes that ultimately result in a change in lived realities of the everyday person. I think in the short term that might not necessarily change overnight. Of course, as well, the fact how we got here in terms of our standard of living, our inequality levels, those were things that were not achieved overnight. So even if government were to embark in trying to decrease our wealth gap, decrease our poverty levels, even if they were to be successful in that, that's not something that would be achieved immediately, but it would constitute a drastic change in that regard as well.
Thank you, Sonia. Just for context for those of you that are listening in, when Sonia was speaking to DCEC and DIS, these are the anti-corruption apparatus and the central intelligence in Botswana, and these had been reporting under the state presidency, but now there's a call to make those more independent so that they can actually enforce their mandate without collusion. So that is a big part of also what has come out of these elections, just the sentiment around better strengthening our institutions or going back to a state where we have more stronger institutions. So a question for you, just to take a bit of a regional look for a little bit before we go back into the bread and butter issues in Botswana currently. You also double up as an election observer, Dr. Malebang, in these elections. And so I'm curious about what would you say are some of the trends vis-a-vis other countries? What does this represent? What is potentially in store for Botswana based off what we've already seen in the region? When Tozama started, she said this was a big election year in the continent. Over 20 countries had voted or were going for elections in the region. We've already seen some changes previously with countries like Zambia, Seychelles. So just in terms of your colleagues across the region and also what you're observing, what do you think this means for Botswana moving forward in terms of the election landscape? And what can we anticipate in that sense?
Thank you so much for the question. I'd say if you mentioned the region, for instance, in Southern Africa, just 2 days ago, we heard that the ruling party in Mauritius had also lost. And that was a clear whitewash in the case of Mauritius, because the opposition or the outgoing party had 0 seats. The opposition took all the seats. And this follows a trend like you started by mentioning South Africa with the government of national unity. And then now we have Botswana, we have Mauritius. In a few days, we are going to see what will happen in Namibia. The difference with Botswana is that unlike some of the other countries where you mentioned South Africa or Namibia, who had to fight liberation wars, these liberation movements come political parties. The dynamic with them is different because they have this sort of closer or deeper ties with their people, because they are seen to have liberated them from the shackles of colonialism. In the case of Botswana, there wasn't much of a struggle. We didn't have like colonialism in the original sense of the word. We had what was a protectorate, where the British offered protectorate to Botswana. And when independence was granted, there wasn't much of a struggle. So that laid the foundation for the kind of politics that we were to have. Unfortunately, having discovered diamonds and embarked on a social welfare state, the people credited the government, the BDP government, because at independence, Botswana was ranked among the 10 poorest countries in the world. It had less than 5 university graduates. It had less than 100 kilometers of tarred road. The entire country, twice the size of France. And with where we came from actually explains how the ruling party stayed in office for so long, because it had a strategy of investing the revenues from the diamonds back into the infrastructure, into the health, into the education and social protection and safety nets of the citizens. So that now, if we were to compare the dynamics taking place in Botswana, they are different from those of other countries, because the average voter in Botswana just wants that certainty and assurance that they will continue enjoying those benefits, and as well as also that there may be economic growth, which may present them with new opportunities. And maybe just to highlight a few of the pointers, riding on the question that you had presented to Sonia earlier, I think even though it's early days, what we have seen the new government doing already is that it has had an inclusive approach to selecting especially elected members of parliament. We see the former Miss Botswana, who was the Miss World Africa, I think, Lesego Chombo, who was elected the youngest Minister of Youth, I think at 26, having come into cabinet as well as Minister Kenowendo Boholo, who's representing females in this regard, I'd say, and also members of other opposition parties. I think it's unprecedented in the history of Botswana to have members of opposition like the BPF and the BPP as part of the UDC, but the BPF members, who is Assistant Minister of Health and the Assistant Minister of Trade, as announced this morning. It shows that there's a desire to have some form of plurality. But what remains as a sore thumb for me is because of the allegations of corruption that were leveled against the former regime. It remains to be seen how decisive the new administration will deal with corruption. Others are even calling for investigations. And of course, Victor mentioned that one social activist was mobilizing people to protest against, the Citizen Entrepreneurial Development Agency for corruption that may have taken place there. But many others on the ground are calling for the previous administration to be investigated and certain decisions that they made to be investigated, because there needs to be, the government needs to be seen to decisively be dealing with elite corruption, which would be a departure from what the previous government had done, because there were accusations that they tended to go for the small fish. But then, just in closing my intervention, another sore thumb, which is the elephant in the room, is the role of former President Seretse Ian Khama. As you know, this was a big election issue in terms of how he had a falling out with former President Masisi. And, in fact, some go as far as saying when President Masisi came in 2018, it was a sympathy vote because people thought that he was being unfairly treated by former President Khama, who wanted his brother to replace President Masisi. And then we saw some members of, or at least opposition strongholds, being won by the former ruling party, the BDP. That was in 2019. Then this time around, we've seen a complete switch where, particularly in the southern part of the country, those seats have gone back to the opposition largely. Then some are worried about the role of former President Khama, who, as his campaign message going around the country, had gone and appealed to citizens to forgive him for having brought President Masisi on board. And then the message was simple. He said that, he appealed to people to assist him to correct that mistake by now voting for his BPF party or the UDC. And then others are asking, could there have been other concessions and agreements behind the scenes between former President Khama and the incumbent new administration, such that now his party is being rewarded with some ministerial seats, and this party has even announced that they would work closely with the new administration. And some are worried that could this be then that former President Khama would be ruling again from the grave? And it remains to be seen how all this will play itself out. Some are saying if you are to investigate the Masisi administration, you should go as far back as the Khama administration. And do we want to go back before we can go forward and advance the interests of Botswana? Or should we just shoot straight into the future with the euphoria that surrounds the current outcome? Let me pause there.
Nail-biting issues, Dr. Malebang. I think, I'm curious to hear thoughts from everybody who's joining us today. Thank you for some of the questions and comments that I'm seeing from Gilbert, Pato, Ditihalo. I appreciate those. I think I've tried to incorporate them. I think I wanted to ask, coming off of what Dr. Gabriel has just said, Victor, at the end of the day, whilst we have quickly changed as government and we are every single day following the very steps that they're taking, interested in what they're doing, there was a lot of financial concentration. And this is the question that actually came from one of registrants beforehand. A lot of financial concentration within the BDP and people who aligned, who hold a lot of economic sway within the country in the BDP. Do you anticipate that that will shift as we move into this new government? And how will that potentially affect the 2019 elections? Do you think the BDP will go quietly into the night and accept this defeat, or they will continue to sway the financial privilege over this new government?
Thank you very much. I think what we are likely to see in the next few months is that first, apart from the financial backing that the former ruling party had because it was in power, they also made money through monthly subscriptions. That is, sitting councillors and sitting members of parliament, they had a monthly fee that they were paying. But if you look at the number of seats they managed to secure and they just ended the election, for instance, in parliament, they only have 4 MPs. The leader of opposition, Dumela Salashando, calls them the 4 tsunami survivors. If you look at that number on its own, it means financially the Tsolesa House would not have as much money as they used to make. And then secondly, if you look at the capital world, capitalists tend to shift towards where there's power because they are trying to buy favors. So what we are likely going to see in the next few months is that those who've been funding the BDP are likely to try and find their way into the pockets, ensure that their money ends in the pockets of those in power now. In fact, someone told me that over the weekend when there was the celebration party at the National Stadium, there were a lot of those people that he identified as having previously funded the former ruling party, being the BDP, and they had spotted those people at the victory party of the UDC. That could give you the first signal in terms of what they're thinking and what they're likely to do in the next several months to come and go into 2029 elections. So it's something that the BDP have to come up with a strategy to see how do they start fundraising for their party, because one, like I said, they have lost the monthly subscriptions. They were likely to get a few tablets and few pillars from councillors and the 4 tsunami survivors, but other than that, the rest is they are not assured of.
Thank you, Victor. It's my first time hearing the 4 tsunami survivors terminology. I hope it stays within this webinar. It took me a little bit by surprise. But there's also another question that came up from registrants before the webinar as well, about this what's the English? Merit-based government, or the push for a merit-based government, or a technocracy in a sense. And there's been a lot of narrative that the UDC has been pushing, that they will award or reward or recognize people who are qualified or competent. However, they still also have the challenge of being a coalition at the end of the day. There are different parties with different interests. And so how will that potentially affect their effectiveness? Dr. Gabriel, looking at where they are and what they potentially have to do very quickly.
Yes, very quickly, I'd say that's a very good question. Thanks for asking that. If you look at, just for context, the UDC is made up of the Botswana National Front, the Alliance for Progressives, and the BPP. Now, the Botswana National Front experienced many defections and a decrease in some of its traditional support base in the run-up to the current elections. And some were even accusing President Boko of prioritizing the UDC project over the BNF, which he is the leader of. And with regard to the Alliance for Progressives, they also experienced a block defection from the AP to the BCP because of some members who did not want to be part of the umbrella. Then the BPP has been somewhat, away from things, or if I was to try and find a better language to use, they haven't really been much of a big factor or player. So now when it comes to selecting talent, for more than 4 or 5 decades, many people or let me say the majority of the citizenry, were educated by the BDP, and with the BDP remaining in power for so long, it was only natural. The culture or the trend was for people to position themselves for seats and rewards and appointments by the BDP. So now there's an issue of trust, or a trust deficit, particularly with regards to the senior civil service politically appointed positions. So the UDC or the UDC would have to look at each of its contracting parties for loyal party cadres who would be deployed. And the question would be, does the BNF have a sufficient number of those? Does the AP have a sufficient number of those qualified cadres and the BPP. But then another issue that I think we missed from the beginning is the ideological issue. When you are asking the question with regards to the shift of whether we would see any differences or radical differences in approach to issues with the new UDC government. The BNF and the BPP are known for their historical socialist or communist inclined ties. But over time, through the UDC brand, the umbrella brand comes from the front concept, which founded one of the founding fathers of the BNF, Dr. Kenneth Koma, came up with. A front being a platform or a bandwagon to carry as many different ideological interests for designed to unseat the ruling BDP. And indeed, we can see that this is the same model of Dr. Koma being applied in present times. However, the ideological element of it hasn't been at the forefront, even in influencing people's choices, even in the manifesto. So we do not, as such, expect for there to be much of a radical shift. Because if you look at a party like the AP is an offshoot of the Botswana Movement for Democracy, which itself is an offshoot of the Botswana Democratic Party. So you can say the AP is a grandchild of the Botswana Democratic Party. And you are having a fusion of ideologies where, I think the meeting point has been social democracy, but from an economic perspective, it's a neoliberal economic agenda as what has brought the country to where it is now, with the partnership with TBS, with the tourism revenues, with the beef industry, and a desire to diversify the economy, particularly with the manufacturing base. So from the tone and projection that we are seeing from the new administration, it would appear that the trajectory would continue in that way. And if there was to be a departure from that, that may also be risky, because Botswana tends to be, or appear to be, a bit conservative, even though you referred to this new block of youthful voters whose voting behavior hasn't thoroughly been interrogated. Do they consider such things as ideology, as manifestos, as all these things? But you did say at the beginning that now, I think it was Sonia, now that they've seen the power of their votes, that they can actually change government. The new administration has to study them and see what would appeal to that demographic as well.
Thank you, Dr. Gabriel. I'm going to ask the one or two questions to both Sonia and Victor, and then I will open up for questions from the floor. So as I said before, you'll be open to raising up your hand, use the raise hand function within Zoom, and then I'll point out to you. But the question that I wanted to ask, and I want to combine a question that I saw, a little bit of what Becky and Kutlo have said in the chat, but also questions that we've received beforehand. There are a lot of policy shifts or things that people want to see. There's the issue of austerity possibly moving forward economically that Botswana have to be prepared for, or are willing to kind of navigate in this new era to support this new government. But there are other smaller issues that have cropped up that I don't think have, I'm not sure if they've garnered as much, dissension or polarization, if I could say, in the public space. So one of those issues are the new government has talked about possibly removing restrictions or improving documentation of Zimbabweans in Botswana. For South Africans, I don't think Botswana, we necessarily have as much of a strong or issue with xenophobia, but the issues of the economy are the same regardless. No matter where you are in the world, people will always feel that people are taking their jobs, regardless of the scale or severity that feels. So that has already come up from this new government, but I don't know if I've seen direct conversations around that. There's also the issue of the constitutional amendment. That was a big part of maybe what contributed to the loss of the BDP. But now it's an issue that still must be addressed because we haven't had a real constitutional review since independence. So do you think these are some of the issues that will come up? Will they challenge this government in a sense? What is your intuition around where Botswana are in these issues and what might shift them maybe when the next election cycle comes? Sonia, first.
Oh, sorry. I was saying, I think the one benefit that the current government has by virtue of being new and by virtue of, what they are ushering into power signified for the democracy, for the country. They enjoy a lot of goodwill at the moment. I don't know if you've had a chance, to look at even social media conversation where, Botswana are even at this moment so protective of the new government that they are not shutting down, but they're not as receptive to calls for accountability around issues that have already come up so far since the official governing started. So I think that's a good thing for the government in that enjoying that goodwill gives you sort of a chance to come up with policy propositions, legal propositions that don't have that much of political consideration to them. A lot of the time, I think, one of the hardest jobs for government is doing what's best for the country and doing what's best for your stay in power. So at the moment, because the government is enjoying so much legitimacy and to an extent protection from Botswana, they are at liberty to focus on the government, the governing side of things and have the benefit of forgetting politics for a bit. But that won't always be the case. That won't always be the case. And as time goes, the usual politicking that we are used to will come up. When the starch wears off of the new government, the issue of what's in it for me? What do you have in store for me as a singular individual, as a singular family, as a specific community? What do you have in store for me? And I think that then is where the true test will come from. I'm sorry, I think I had missed, there was a second part to your question as well.
The issues around documentation of foreign nationals and also constitutional amendment. How do you think those will fare out for this new government?
Yes. Well, with the constitutional amendment, I would consider that one of low-hanging fruits. If you look at the extent of flaw that the previous government put their attempt or at the same through, it's sort of being given the same question or the same test that your friend took the day before, and you were privy to their script, so you know exactly where they went wrong. So I think in terms of that, it's one, like I said, I consider it one of the issues that if government were to fail or be as disastrous at it as the BDP was, I would consider that an own goal. And of course, I think I'll consider them off to a good start just based on the promises they've made in their manifesto around the issue of the constitutional review process. They made overt claims about how they would embark on that process, and the president himself in the past few days has even given a timeline that that's something they intend. I think he said in the next 6 months or 3 months. I forget the exact timeline, but yeah. So that one, I expect that it will at the very least be better than that of the previous government, and at best be one of the best attempts at amending a constitution that we've seen. So you can see that just from the get-go, it's there's room for there's great room for greatness in that regard. The Zimbabwean issue, if you look at it, that's the one where I'd say perhaps it was one of the issues that I would want the government to tread carefully on. Like you said, Botswana don't necessarily identify with strong feelings, of xenophobia as perhaps we've come to identify our South African counterparts with, but they are still self-interested, self-serving in the sense that there is that sentiment that, there are some non-Botswana, Zimbabweans included, that have taken up especially economic space where, Botswana themselves feel they could try their luck in that regard. So any attempts or any changes that seem to give or maintain the upper hand of non-Botswana, whether it be Zimbabweans or any other non-Botswana, that would definitely be encroaching into the territory of upsetting Botswana. And I think Dr. Malebang rightfully pointed out earlier that a large part of Botswana that voted for the UDC, it's not that they resonated entirely with the UDC messaging and identity. They were protesting against the BDP. And to the extent that we don't know how much of the voter base that was, the government would do good to tread carefully with certain issues, because that's the voter base that's most likely to be ticked off by, even the smallest things, because from the get-go, they were not really resonating with the identity and ideology of the party. So yeah, that's definitely an issue to tread carefully on. And I wouldn't call it perhaps a Zimbabwean issue, but the issue of Botswana versus them, and them being any other group that's not Botswana. Yeah.